Hey Froggy friends, Kirostyle here, welcome back to another video. So, we just finished Ace Attorney Investigations Collection the other day, and I made a video going over the dev blogs about localization concerning the great Ace Attorney, Chronicles. And I did that because I wanted to make a video about this particular article here. This is from the dev blogs of Ace Attorney Investigations Collection, and is also pertaining to localization. And I just wanted to go through it because I think it's, again, a very educational article that teaches you a little bit about localization and game development. So, the Ace Attorney Investigations Collection official website has these dev blogs, and there's only 3 of them, unlike Ace Attorney or Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, where there are 8 of them. But still, I think they're very interesting. And so, there's 3 of them, but we're going to go over this first one here, Volume 1. So Volume 1 is Localization and Technology, or How Over a Decade of Progress Affects Your Localization, by Localization Director Janet Hsu, who also wrote the article we went over in the last video. So let's go over this, and I don't think there's these were released before Ace Attorney Investigations Collection came out, so there are going to be pictures that might be slightly spoilery, but they shouldn't be too spoilery, so it depends on what level of spoiler you're comfortable with. If you want to go into the game completely blind, you might want to wait until after the game, or after watching my playthrough of the game, to read this article. So let's go over this, and I'm going to read over this through Janet's words, and then add my own little commentary here and there. It's finally here. Over 10 years later, the second Investigations game is finally officially available starting today. I hope you're as excited as I am. I'm Janet Hsu, the Localization Director of Ace Attorney Investigations Collection, and I'm here for a special one-off about the more technical side of localization. I've talked at length about my localization philosophy in my Great Ace Attorney blogs, so I figured I'd take this rare chance to talk about the differences in my experience of localizing the first Investigations game into English in 2011, and the second into multiple languages in 2024. A lot has changed in these last 13 years. By 2011, Capcom had the MT Framework game engine, but the first and second Investigations games ran on their own custom engines. The screens on the Nintendo DS were also very small and 4:3 aspect ratio. The simultaneous worldwide releases of multiple language versions wasn't the ironclad industry standard it is now, which, when combined with the storage limitations of a game cartridge or DVD, affected even how game assets were named. Game development was like a totally different world back then. So, come along as I now show you how old I am by regaling you with tales of back in my day Localization Games Edition. Engine improvements and the UI. In a series like Ace Attorney, the UI is everything. It's the way all information is conveyed and the way the player interacts with the game. Unlike action games, for example, there's literally nothing else. Therefore, improvements in UI implementation mean a great deal for the series, and by extension, the localization. In the olden days, all of the buttons and panels players interacted with in the Nintendo DS version were graphics with the text baked in. This is because it was hard at times to make the text look exactly as you envisioned, especially when you need to squeeze more letters on a panel than it was designed for. So the only way to ensure that you got the exact look, amount of scrunching, etc. that you wanted was to make everything into a graphic. Of course, this also meant that every little text change was another time-consuming task for the UI designer, who had to go back and re-render the graphic. It's enough to make one feel guilty for each typo and grammar mistake. Needless to say, this method is unsustainable the more languages you add. So thankfully, as text rendering technology improved through modern game engine tools, we've been able to move away from using graphics for everything. So, for the Ace Attorney Investigations Collection, we actually went through both titles and converted the pre-existing Japanese and English graphical panels, such as the topic selections and logic pieces, into regular text that is rendered in real time on top of one shared blank graphic. As you can see here, auto-scaling panels are also blessings for the languages with longer words. Plus, we can do special effects like how panels get slightly bigger when selected and go half-transparent when they're not. The decision to render each panel's text in-game meant that the programmers had to go through and make sure that every localization, or every location, where these graphical assets were once being called would now call the correct text string instead. And of course, they had to make sure each new string in each additional language version would also be called correctly. In the end, we localizers are super thankful for the UI designers and programmers' hard work, because it meant we could make adjustments to our translations almost completely guilt-free. Another big change in the UI that affected the localization was the amount of space available to us on screen, which is related to the screen size and resolution of the hardware the games are on. 16 by 9, 1080p becoming the standard. Yes, by 2011, 4:3 and standard definition screens had pretty much disappeared in terms of TVs, but it wasn't so far removed from when that was the majority of people had in their homes. Perhaps that's why the Nintendo DS's 4:3 aspect ratio didn't feel so out of place back then. In addition, the Nintendo DS obviously had very small screen for portability reasons, so while we did upgrade the graphics once for smartphones, we haven't adapted some of it because of how small the screen still was, and because every phone had their own set of hardware specs and aspect ratio. With this port to a more standardized series of platforms, we took to finally expanding all the graphics to 16 by 9 and filling in some of the details you couldn't really see before. So, like Ace Attorney Investigations 1 did get some different ports on some mobile devices as well, before coming to the Nintendo Switch. Let's just say there's a reason why there was a whole discussion about whether we should add a roll of toilet paper to the holder or not. That explains that. We mentioned this during our playthrough of the game. So how did making the screen 16 by 9 help the localization? Well, for one thing, the added horizontal space allowed less compact languages like English to use longer words. In the era of the original Nintendo DS version, we still used the number of characters times number of lines method of calculating how much text could fit in each box. So when I was localizing the first Ace Attorney Investigations game, I had to stick to the 30 characters times 3 lines rule because of how narrow the screen was for the main text window. So if you see here, the first picture says in the Nintendo DS says, "Look what I'm getting at." It says, "Look, what I'm getting at is that if I had been there too." Oh, sorry, I can't read today. "Look, what I'm getting at is that if I had been there, no one would have died." And then on the right, "Look, what I'm getting at is if I had been there, no one would have died." But now it's on 2 lines, and it looks a little bit cleaner with a little bit more space. As you can see by redoing the line breaks into the modern UI layout for this collection, I could have had so much more space to work with, even with just 2 lines. Plus, I wouldn't have needed to worry about the text window blocking something important when compared to the Japanese version. Yeah, so in the second screenshot, you can see there's a lot of empty space after the word died that we didn't have on the left. However, as someone who works with text knows, you can never have too much space. Sometimes a slightly longer word is simply required to avoid an awkward rewrite, or to convey a nuance. But if we stick hard and fast to the 30 times 3, or 50 times 2 in the modern UI rule, there's always the potential for wasted space. In fact, if you count the actual number of letters in the first line of the screenshot above, you'll see there are actually 57 letters. That's also thanks to a bit of wizardry I've asked for since the days of Dual Destinies, a pixel checker. Because Western and other Western European language fonts are generally proportional, as opposed to fixed width like Asian languages are, every letter is of a different width. In this title's UI settings, skinny letters like lowercase I and L are 17 pixels across, while a larger letter like M is 52, and an average size letter like A is 30. Even a single space takes up 18 pixels, so you can see how depending on what words you use, you can squeeze more letters on one line than just the average number of 50, if we work off of a maximum of 1500 pixels per line. So let's compare these. The president is in the middle of a speech here. I need to think carefully about this moment in time. And then characters and pixels, 53, we can see the pixel numbers changing. What is Mr. Doe talking about? Which piece of evidence is inconsistent with what's in the picture? Let's compare these. The president is in the middle of a speech here. I need to think carefully about this moment in time. The president is in the middle of a speech here, which means what? What is Mr. Doe talking about? Which piece of evidence is inconsistent with what's in the picture? What's Mr. Doe talking about? Which piece is inconsistent with what's in the picture? While it's not impossible to convey what needs to be conveyed in a natural way in the old 30 by 3 style, you can see I had to allude to the fact that something about the president being in the middle of his speech is important. Contrast that with how it could be spelled out in full like in the original Japanese, with the luxury of more usable space. Also, you can see how in order to save myself a few letters, I truncated what is into what's, and relied on the fact that the next screen is the organizer opening up to give context as to what the word piece is in reference to the second text window. These small changes might not seem like much, but depending on what you're trying to achieve, they can be a big deal. For example, what if a character is the type to never use contractions because they're too posh to do so? Or what if I really need to direct the player's attention to something specific, or it would be very hard for them to solve the puzzle? There are sorts of things that I have to balance whenever I write anything during a localization. What can I sacrifice of a character's voice for brevity? How do I rewrite this hint to the player so it's still comprehensible and will fit within the text box? It surely pays to learn how to write with an economy of words in these cases. Does that mean, then, that an infinitely large box where I could write whatever I wanted would be preferable? I actually don't think so. I'm convinced that part of the appeal of Ace Attorney's writing is in how short and simple each line is. No one line feels like a chore to read, and before you know it, you're 100 lines on and have gone through 3 dialogue options. It is all thanks to Mr. Takami's original design concept of text short enough players can take in the whole text box at a glance. It's why the Japanese text is also written in an exceptionally short style at 18 characters times 2 lines for the main dialogue window. That's really interesting, I think, as well. So many things to consider, and the way the game design plays into the way you localize it, in addition to things like the languages as well. And I definitely feel it. When I'm reading through Ace Attorney, I don't get as tired because the text boxes are nice and short, as opposed to when I was like streaming Umaneko, for example, where we would have long blocks of text sometimes, and sometimes it would feel like a little bit of a chore. And I felt like my voice would get tired faster. I've noticed that for the Great Ace Attorney, some people have commented on how the verboseness of the dialogue makes it harder for them to get into those games when compared to mainline games. In that particular duology's case, it was an artistic choice to mimic Victorian-era writing, and yet I believe those comments lend credence to the statement that brevity is the soul of wit. In fact, one of the issues we had during the localization of Prosecutor's Gambit was tone consistency. Because we had more space to work with in the first game, the initial translations sometimes contained sentences that were longer than necessary. So one of the things I did was to go through and pare things down so that Edgeworth Company didn't sound too tonally different from the first Investigations game while remaining accurate to the Japanese. Okay, I know I said no waxing localization philosophy in this blog entry, so let's get back on track, shall we? Speaking of consistency, an interesting thing that often happens on HD remasters of Ace Attorney games is the need to suddenly fill in the backgrounds with text you had previously written into examined dialogue. Take, for example, the judge poster in the first game. When we were listing up how each graphic would need to be updated, one of the things we had to do was recall which examinable items had what text connected to it. Back on the Nintendo DS, you couldn't see what was written on the poster, for example, so there wasn't even placeholder text scrawled at the very bottom. But now, if we don't add the slogan that's supposed to exist in tiny letters to the poster, it would create a disconnect between the visuals and the examination message. So we added the in-game dialogue to the bottom of the poster for consistency's sake. As for what it says, you'll just have to see for yourself. By the way, if you guessed that the reason we had a whole discussion about toilet paper is because of examination text, give yourself a pat on the back. Another thing the new 16:9 graphical update affected was how we localized the graphics for each language. In some instances, there was a need to redesign some element or another so that the key point from the Japanese source was conveyed correctly. So, smell the 4x3-ness. For example, this is a food stall that sells sakura-flavored manju. Manju are small, sweet pastry items. Now, what exactly is sakura supposed to taste like is something even Japanese people wonder about. So, it was nice that we keep the examined dialogue where Gamshu asks Edgeworth what sakura tastes like the same in the English and Japanese. Apparently, sakura flavor is a taste of coumarin, an organic compound in cherry tree leaves that is only released once you crush or salt the leaves. It's an answer only Emma could find fascinating, I know. Because the examined dialogue is specifically about the flavor of sakura, sakura itself becomes an important piece of information to convey. To that end, I made this mock-up on how to localize the graphic for the artists. So, here on the right side, it says, Sakura being legible is important. It's a samurai dog in a Japanese-style font is fine, but let's discuss further. Quotations now with quotations should be in simpler font, but I leave the color up to you. Remove the kanji. In its place, add pictures of sakura to reinforce the sakura-ness of the banner. You can leave the original lavender sakura design if you like. Since we're expanding this base image to 16:9, I thought I was being smart by using that extra space on the right to have the word sakura be clearly visible. To reinforce that, I added the Sakura pictures at the bottom, since it worked well design-wise and was similar to the original Japanese version, which also featured a lavender Sakura design under the character for Sakura. The final result is this lovely background here. Way to go, me! The lesson to be learned here is to let iconography do the work for you when you can't fit the words you need in. Icons also help when you forget, like a foolishly foolish fool, that there'll be a lantern covering up the very word you're trying to make visible. But hey, at least the important information was still conveyed. Yeah, the lantern's covering up the word Sakura. I made mock-ups for some of the other language-based tricks in the additional new languages as well, which leads me to my next topic, localizing for more than one language. So in this picture from the very first case of the first investigations game, one clue is left as a word written in blood on the bookshelf, but one of the books is missing. ROM sizes and distribution mediums. Back in the days before the cloud and digital distribution, how much the physical cartridge or disc could store dictated how much stuff you can put in your game. And oftentimes it meant only one language version would fit on one cartridge. So even if the standard was to create all language versions at the same time, you would still have to contend with the hard limit of the medium you were publishing on. But let's say you did create more than one language version at a time. In the olden days, you might have gotten away with using the exact same file names for all the assets, regardless of the language version, since there was no chance of them winding up on the same cartridge. So one of the big updates we had to do for the Investigations collection was to rework some of the programming to accommodate all the localized assets. This applies to the UI assets I mentioned at the very beginning too, but the programmers had to come up with a naming scheme so the original assets and the localized assets could all live happily together, and anyone working on any new graphics, sound, or text had to stick to this naming scheme. And then the programmers had to think of a way so that each location that called for an asset would display the correct one depending on the game's settings. For example, if you set the text to English but the audio to Japanese, the game has to know which text to display and which objection to play. That's actually really interesting. I didn't even consider having the audio language different from the text language, because there isn't that much audio in Ace Attorney games, but definitely there's a lot of, objection shouting and stuff. Just look at all these samurai dogs. So you see, when localizing an older game, it's more than simply tweaking or adding a few new assets. It's like implementing all the assets of a whole other game sometimes. These are just a few ways technological changes affected how we localized the Ace Attorney Investigations collections. Some of these things may seem small, but each advancement in technology brings with it the potential to make an even higher quality localization than ever before. Whether it's improvements to the workflow or the ability to do what we have only dreamed of, I can't wait to see how the process and philosophies of localization will continue to evolve alongside the technology of the future. Until then. So, again, another really informative article from Janet, and I really love her takes on some of the things that we have to do for localizing. And again, it's kind of a nice little peek behind the curtain. I mentioned in my last video how, the word localization is sometimes scary for people. Sometimes they say, oh, I don't want localization, I just want a direct translation. Or we don't need localizers, we can replace them with AIs. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of other things we need to take into account as well. And I just find that really fascinating. And like I said again in my last video, it's not really a matter of good localization and bad localization. It's like a spectrum between good and bad of where localization for a given medium rests, and depending on who is at the helm of the ship. But if you're interested, I would totally recommend going back and looking through the dev blogs for both the Great Ace Attorney and Ace Attorney Investigations collection, because there's a lot of interesting articles here about game dev. So if you're interested in game dev, I think it's really worth a read. Anyways, thanks for joining me today, guys, and I'll see you later. Bye, Froggy friends!